Now imagine this for a second. You are feeling sick, really, really sick. So you go to the doctor, they run some tests, scratch their heads, and send you home. But you do not get better. You get worse. So you go back, and then you go again, and again, and again. 31 times in 10 months, you drag yourself to different hospitals all over the state, begging someone, anyone, to figure out what is making you so ill. But every single doctor looks at you, looks at your medical history, and decides that you are just crazy, that it is all in your head, that you are making the whole thing up for attention. Meanwhile, the person responsible for your suffering is standing right beside you, holding your hand, playing the role of the worried husband. That is exactly what happened to a 52-year-old woman named Carol Hellar in a tiny town in Oklahoma back in 1995. And by the time someone finally realized what was really going on, it was too late. This should have been the perfect crime, but it was not. So settle in, because this story is absolutely wild from start to finish. Hi, sweet ones. My name is Grandma Kitty, and before we dive in, take a second to subscribe if cases like this intrigue you. It helps me keep these stories coming, and while you're at it, tell me where you're watching from. That's how we find our neighbors here in our little true crime corner. Let me tell you about Carol. She was 52 years old and had just been through a really rough divorce. You know how it is when a marriage falls apart. Everything you thought your life was going to be just crumbles right in front of your eyes. Carol needed a fresh start. She needed to get away and begin again somewhere new. So she packed up her things and moved to a tiny little town called Perry in Oklahoma. Now, when I say tiny, I mean tiny. We are talking about 5,000 people, give or take. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody. The kind of place where violent crime is almost unheard of. It seemed like the perfect spot for a woman who just wanted some peace and quiet and a chance to rebuild her life. But here is something important you need to know about Carol. She had been fighting a battle her whole life. A battle that most people could not see from the outside. Carol struggled with something called manic depression, which nowadays we call bipolar disorder. It is a condition that affects your moods in very extreme ways. Sometimes you feel on top of the world with endless energy. Other times you sink so low you can barely function. Now, despite this struggle, Carol was determined to make her new life work. She got herself involved in the local church and became a regular face there every Sunday. She made friends in the community. People liked her. She was building something good in this little town. But something was still missing. See, there are some people in this world who just do not feel complete unless they have a partner by their side. Carol was one of those people. She had friends. She had her church family. But she wanted a man in her life, someone to share things with, someone to come home to, someone to help take care of the day-to-day stuff like household finances and all that. So Carol came up with an idea. She decided to place a personal ad in a local Christian newspaper. She figured if she was going to find someone, she wanted a good Christian man who shared her values and her faith. And sure enough, somebody answered that ad. His name was Dennis Hellar. He was 51 years old, just a year younger than Carol. He worked as a handyman, doing odd jobs here and there. Nothing fancy, but honest work. The two of them started talking. Then they started dating, and things seemed to be going really well between them. Now, Carol's family was cautiously optimistic about this new relationship, but they also wanted to make sure Dennis knew exactly what he was getting into. So they sat him down and had a serious conversation with him. They told him all about Carol's mental health history. They explained the bipolar disorder and what it meant. They wanted him to understand that life with Carol might not always be easy. And you know what Dennis said? He said he understood. He said he knew what he was signing up for. He assured them that he could handle it and that he cared about Carol regardless of her struggles. Well, that was good enough for everyone. Within a year of meeting each other, Carol and Dennis got married. It seemed like Carol had finally found what she was looking for. A fresh start in a new town with a new husband who accepted her for who she was. Things were looking up, but it was not long before some of Carol's old demons started creeping back. She started having episodes again. Sometimes she would just wander away from the house for no apparent reason. Her family and friends would have to go out looking for her and bring her back home. Other times things got bad enough that she ended up in the emergency room at the hospital. A few times she even had to be taken to a mental health facility for evaluation. The doctors there would try to get her stabilized and adjust her medications. Carol's own father asked her one time a very difficult question. He said, "Carol, have you ever thought about killing yourself?" And she was honest with him. She said yes, she had thought about it before. That is how dark things could get for her sometimes. The doctors decided to prescribe her lithium. Now, if you do not know, lithium is a very common medication for people with bipolar disorder. It helps stabilize the mood swings and keeps people on a more even level. Carol took her lithium like she was supposed to, and for the most part, she handled the depressive episodes pretty well. The manic phases were more of a challenge, but she was managing. But then something strange started happening. Carol began experiencing some really uncomfortable symptoms. She was feeling nauseous all the time. She was drowsy and tired, even when she should not have been. And her speech started getting slurred, like she had been drinking, even though she had not touched a drop of alcohol. The doctors looked at her symptoms and figured it must be the lithium causing these problems. That happens sometimes with medication, so they reduced her dosage, thinking that would help, but it did not help, not one bit. The symptoms kept right on going. Carol was miserable. She felt awful all the time, so she started going to different doctors, trying to find someone who could figure out what was wrong with her and give her some relief. She went to doctors in Perry. She went to doctors in Stillwater. She went to Ponca City. She went all the way to Oklahoma City. She even traveled to Denver, Colorado, hoping someone there might have answers. But nobody could figure it out. Every doctor she saw would run some tests, stabilize her for a little while, and then send her home. They would either say they solved the problem or admit they had no idea what the problem was. And then a month later, Carol would be right back in another hospital with the same symptoms all over again. After a while, the doctors and nurses started tuning her out. They saw her coming in over and over again with the same complaints, and they started thinking maybe this was all in her head. Maybe she was just being dramatic. Maybe her mental health issues were making her imagine things. Can you imagine how frustrating that must have been for Carol? She knew something was wrong with her body. She could feel it, but nobody would believe her. All of this was putting a serious strain on her new marriage, too. When Carol talked to her family, she sounded completely beaten down. She told them she thought Dennis was getting disgusted with her. She said she had been sick the entire time they had been married. Not exactly the fresh start she had been hoping for. She felt like a burden on the man she loved. Carol became absolutely convinced that the lithium was the root of all her problems. In her mind, the medication that was supposed to be helping her was actually making her sick. So she made a decision. Against her doctor's orders, she stopped taking the lithium altogether. And that is when things really started to go downhill. One Sunday morning, something unusual happened at the little church in Perry, Oklahoma. Carol Hellar was not there. Now, you have to understand, Carol never missed church. She was one of those people who was there every single Sunday without fail. Rain or shine, feeling good or feeling bad, Carol showed up. It was part of who she was. So when her seat was empty that morning, people noticed right away. Dennis was there, though, and he told the congregation that Carol had taken a turn for the worse. She was too sick to come. People nodded their heads and said they would pray for her. They figured she would bounce back like she always did and be there the following week. But Carol would never set foot in that church again. That very night, Dennis called for an ambulance. When the paramedics arrived at the apartment, they found Carol in a coma. She was completely unresponsive. This was not like her other episodes. This was something far more serious. The situation was so bad that they could not even treat her at the local hospital. They had to call in a helicopter to transport her to a bigger hospital in Oklahoma City, about 60 miles away. Every minute counted. Carol's family got the phone call they had been dreading. They rushed to the hospital, hoping and praying that Carol would pull through somehow. But deep down, they already knew. About an hour after that phone call, the worst was confirmed. Carol never woke up. She never regained consciousness. She was gone. The doctors said she died from congestive heart failure. Her heart just gave out. That was the official explanation, and everyone accepted it. Carol had been sick for so long that it almost seemed inevitable that her body would eventually give up. Now here is where things get complicated. Normally when someone dies and there are any questions at all, the medical examiner performs an autopsy. They examine the body to figure out exactly what happened. But this was June of 1995. Just 6 weeks earlier, something terrible had happened in Oklahoma City. The bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. 168 people died in that bombing. It was one of the worst terrorist attacks in American history, and the medical examiner's office was completely overwhelmed. They were still trying to identify victims from that tragedy. Bodies were backed up, resources were stretched thin. So when Carol Hellar died of what appeared to be natural causes, nobody ordered an autopsy. There was just too much else going on. Her death did not seem suspicious enough to warrant the extra attention. And then there was the matter of Carol's final wishes. She had always said she wanted to be cremated when she died, so that is exactly what happened. Her body was cremated quickly, without even being embalmed first. Her family was just honoring what she wanted. But here is the thing about cremation. Once a body is burned to ashes, there is no going back. Any evidence that might have been hidden inside that body is gone forever. No second chances, no do-overs. At the time, nobody thought twice about it. But looking back, this decision would make everything so much harder for the people trying to figure out what really happened to Carol. Now let me tell you about some of the strange things people started noticing about Dennis Hellar. Remember when I told you the paramedics came to the apartment that night? Well, here is what happened when they walked through that door. Dennis was sitting on the couch, talking on the telephone, just having a casual conversation like nothing was wrong. When the paramedics came in, he did not even look up at them. He did not acknowledge them at all. He just kept right on talking on that phone. The paramedics needed to know where the patient was. They asked Dennis what room Carol was in. And you know what he did? Nothing. He did not respond. He did not point them in the right direction. He did not even pause his phone conversation. So these paramedics had to go searching through the apartment on their own, opening doors and looking in rooms until they finally found Carol unconscious on the bed. Now tell me, what kind of husband does that? Your wife is dying in the other room, you called for help, and when help arrives, you cannot even be bothered to get off the phone and show them where she is? That did not sit right with people. And then there was the funeral. Most husbands would be sitting right up front at their wife's memorial service, right there with the family, grieving together, supporting each other, but not Dennis. He sat about 4 rows behind Carol's family, almost like he did not want to be associated with them. And here is the part that really got people talking. During the memorial service, while people were crying and sharing memories of Carol, Dennis was dozing off to sleep, just nodding off like he was watching a boring television program instead of saying goodbye to his wife. People noticed, people talked, and people started to wonder. Now, before I tell you what investigators discovered next, I need you to do something for me. If you have made it this far into the story, just drop a like on this video. It takes half a second and it helps more than you know. And if you are not subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that button because this story is about to take a very dark turn. All right, let me tell you what happened next. A detective named David Farrow heard about all these strange behaviors and decided to do a little digging. He went over to the apartment building where Carol and Dennis had lived to have a look around and ask some questions. The building manager had quite a story to tell him. The day before Carol died, this manager was going about her business when she noticed something strange. There were huge flames coming from the outdoor grill behind Dennis and Carol's apartment. It looked like Dennis was cooking something out there, but when he went back inside and the manager went to check on the grill, she got a surprise. There was no food in there, no burgers, no hot dogs, nothing you would normally cook on a grill. Instead, there was just a pile of burnt paper, pieces of documents that had been completely destroyed by fire. The manager had no idea what Dennis was burning out there or why, and that was not all. Later that same night, the night before Carol died, the manager saw Dennis again. This time he was carrying boxes, lots and lots of boxes, and he was throwing them all into the dumpster. Detective Farrow decided to check out what was in those boxes, and what he found made his blood run cold. Those boxes were filled with Carol's personal belongings, things that meant something to her, things that should have been treasured and kept. There was a Bible in there, not just any Bible, but one that had been given to Carol by her own father. It was old and worn, clearly a family heirloom that had been passed down with love, and Dennis had thrown it in the trash. There were letters, documents, personal items, things you would find in someone's dresser drawers, memories of a lifetime, all of it tossed in the dumpster like garbage. Now here is the question that should be bouncing around in your head right now. Why would someone throw away their wife's belongings the day before she died? Carol was still alive when Dennis burned those papers. She was still alive when he carried those boxes to the dumpster. She was still breathing in that apartment while her husband was erasing every trace of her existence. How did he know she was going to die? Unless he knew something nobody else did. I want to hear what you think about this. Drop a comment down below and tell me what is going through your mind right now. Does this seem like the behavior of a grieving husband to you? Investigators kept searching through that apartment and they found something else that raised red flags, something in the kitchen pantry that did not belong there. A container of antifreeze. Now think about that for a second. Antifreeze. That is the stuff you put in your car's radiator. Maybe you keep a jug of it in your garage or your shed or the trunk of your car, but the kitchen pantry, right there next to the food and the spices and the cooking supplies. Detective Farrow had been doing this job for a long time. He had been in a lot of people's homes, and he had never once seen anyone keep antifreeze in their kitchen. Not once. When they asked Dennis about it, he had an explanation ready. He said it was Carol's idea to keep the antifreeze in the kitchen. He said that back in November, Carol had drunk half a gallon of antifreeze in a suicide attempt. And now he suspected she might have done it again because half of a new gallon was missing. It was a convenient story. It painted Carol as unstable and suicidal. It made everything look like her own fault. And here's the thing. Dennis had already laid the groundwork for this story. He had told Carol's own sisters about the antifreeze before she died. He mentioned finding antifreeze in Carol's closet with some of it missing. At the time, it seemed like a strange thing to bring up, but now it looked like he was setting up his alibi. There was just one problem with Dennis's story. The night Carol died, the doctors at the hospital ran tests on her blood. Standard procedure. And those tests showed absolutely no sign of ethylene glycol in her system. That is the main ingredient in antifreeze. If Carol had drunk antifreeze, it would have shown up in those tests. But there was nothing there. So either Dennis was lying about the antifreeze, or something else was going on that nobody understood yet. But here is where investigators hit a wall. Even if they suspected foul play, how could they prove it? Carol's body had already been cremated. There was no way to go back and do an autopsy now. Whatever secrets her body might have held were nothing but ashes. It seemed like the perfect crime. If someone had killed Carol Hellar, they were going to get away with it. But these investigators were not ready to give up. Detective Farrow teamed up with another detective named Buzz Busby. Together they decided to do something that most people would find incredibly tedious. They were going to go through every single page of Carol's medical records. And there were a lot of pages, 4,000 of them to be exact. The two detectives took over a spare courtroom and started organizing. They came up with a system. Each chair in that courtroom would represent a different month in Carol's life. Then they would sort all the medical records by date and place them on the appropriate chair. When they were finally done sorting, something jumped out at them immediately. The chair for March of 1995 was completely empty. Not a single piece of paper on it. Now remember, Carol had been to the hospital 31 times in 10 months. She was in and out of emergency rooms and doctors' offices constantly. There were medical records for every other month, but March, nothing. Not one hospital visit, not one doctor's appointment, nothing at all. Why would there be no records for that one specific month when every other month was overflowing with them? The detectives started digging, and they found their answer. In March of 1995, Dennis Hellar was not home. He was in jail in Oklahoma City. He had been arrested for shoplifting and spent that month locked up behind bars. Think about that for a second. Every single month that Dennis was living with Carol, she was deathly ill, in and out of hospitals, suffering from mysterious symptoms that nobody could explain. But the one month that Dennis was away, the one month he was sitting in a jail cell and could not be near her, Carol was perfectly fine, not a single hospital visit. Now let me ask you something. Do you think that is just a coincidence? Because I sure do not. Tell me what you think in the comments. I really want to know. The investigators kept digging through those medical records, and they found something else. Something that one doctor had noticed but nobody had followed up on. Shortly before Carol died, she went to a hospital in Ponca City, about 50 miles away. She was complaining about the same things as always. Slurred speech, confusion, feeling terrible, the usual. But this doctor, a man named Danny Cassidy, he noticed something in Carol's blood work that gave him pause. Her acid levels were elevated, way higher than they should have been. There is a medical term for this condition. It is called metabolic acidosis. Now, Dr. Cassidy knew that there are only a few things that can cause those kinds of elevated acid levels in someone's blood, and most of them are not good. So he ordered some additional tests. He wanted to check for unusual toxins, things like methanol, which is wood, alcohol, and highly poisonous, things that should not be in a person's system. But these specialized tests took time. The results would not be back for about a week. Dr. Cassidy told Carol she should stay in the hospital and wait for those results. But Carol did not want to stay. She was tired of hospitals. She was tired of doctors poking and prodding her and never finding any answers. She just wanted to go home. And here is the sad truth. The doctor could not force her to stay. Carol was an adult. She was not threatening to hurt anyone. She was not an immediate danger to herself. Legally, she had every right to leave if she wanted to. So she left. She walked right out of that hospital with her husband Dennis by her side. About a week later, the test results finally came back to Carol's personal physician. And there it was, right there in black and white, ethylene glycol, 6 milligrams per deciliter. The main ingredient in antifreeze was in Carol's blood. But it was too late. By the time her doctor got those results, Carol was already dead. She had already been cremated. The answers they had been searching for all those months had finally arrived, but Carol was not around to hear them. Now the investigators had a new question to answer. How did ethylene glycol get into Carol's system? There were really only two possibilities. Either Carol put it there herself in some kind of slow suicide attempt, or someone else put it there. Someone who wanted her dead. They needed an expert. Someone who really understood this stuff. So they started making phone calls and reaching out to specialists, and everybody they talked to pointed them in the same direction. A man named Dr. Alphonse Poclis in Virginia. Dr. Poclis was one of the world's foremost authorities on ethylene glycol poisoning. If anyone could help them understand what happened to Carol, it was him. Dr. Poclis reviewed all of Carol's medical records, and right away he spotted something that everyone else had missed. Carol's symptoms, the slurred speech, the confusion, the nausea, the lack of coordination, the drowsiness, all those things that doctors had blamed on lithium for months and months. Those exact same symptoms are also caused by ethylene glycol poisoning. The two conditions look almost identical. Carol had been telling her doctors over and over again that something was wrong, that it was not just the lithium, that something else was making her sick. But because of her mental health history, nobody took her seriously. They all assumed she was being paranoid or difficult. It was like a Greek tragedy, Dr. Poclis said. The sicker Carol got, the more she complained. And the more she complained, the more the doctors dismissed her as a mental health case. Meanwhile, the real cause of her illness went completely undetected. But here is the key thing Dr. Poclis pointed out. The amount of ethylene glycol found in Carol's blood was 6 milligrams per deciliter. That is only about 1/3 of a lethal dose. If Carol had been trying to kill herself, why would she take just 1/3 of what was needed? That does not make sense. What does make sense is slow poisoning. Someone giving her a little bit at a time, day after day, week after week, making her sick but not quite killing her, until finally her body just could not take anymore. Dr. Poclis put it plainly, that is a strange way to commit suicide. Nobody poisons themselves slowly over 9 or 10 months. Nobody makes themselves repeatedly ill for almost a year just to eventually die. That is not how suicide works. This was murder. Slow, calculated, deliberate murder. Now, what I am about to tell you is how they finally caught him. But first, if you are still here, I need you to tap that like button for me. Just a quick tap. It really helps get this story out to more people who need to hear it. All right, now let me tell you about the girlfriend. Yes, you heard that right, the girlfriend. See, Dennis Hellar had a secret. All those times he went to Oklahoma City for this reason or that reason, he was not just running errands. He had a woman there. Her name was Karen Dawson, and Dennis had been seeing her for most of the time he was married to Carol. After Carol died, Karen started putting the pieces together. She started thinking about things Dennis had said and done, things that did not make sense before but made perfect sense now. And she decided she was willing to help the police Karen told investigators something that made their jaws drop. Before Carol died, while she was still alive and breathing, Dennis brought Carol's wedding rings to Karen. He had Karen try them on, see how they fit on her finger. He told Karen that those rings would soon be hers. How did Dennis know those rings would be available soon? How did he know he would not need them for his wife anymore? And there was something else, something strange about Dennis. He had a thing for cheerleader outfits. Do not ask me to explain it because I cannot. But Dennis had actually gone to a secondhand store and bought a 1960s style cheerleader outfit. Lemon yellow with pleats. Originally, he had bought it for Carol to wear, a 53-year-old woman in a vintage cheerleader costume. But Carol never wore it, so Dennis gave it to Karen instead. The investigators came up with a plan. They convinced Karen to help them catch Dennis in the act of confessing. She would wear a wire, a hidden microphone, and they asked her to wear something specific. The cheerleader outfit. They figured if Dennis saw Karen in that outfit, he would be relaxed, happy, more likely to let his guard down and say something incriminating. So Karen put on that ridiculous lemon yellow cheerleader costume. She hid the microphone where nobody would see it, and she went on a date with Dennis to a drive-in restaurant. Across the street, in an unmarked van, Detective Farrow and Detective Busby were listening to every single word. Karen started the conversation casual, but then she got serious. She told Dennis that if they were going to have any kind of future together, he needed to be completely honest with her. No more secrets, no more lies. She needed to know the truth about everything. Then she asked him directly, "Did you have anything to do with Carol's death?" And Dennis, feeling comfortable, feeling like he was with someone he could trust, finally told the truth. He admitted everything. He said he put it in her food. He described how he used an eyedropper to add small amounts of antifreeze to the things she ate, a little bit at a time, just enough to make her sick, but not enough to kill her right away. He actually bragged about it. He said he was proud of himself for pulling it off. He thought he had fooled everyone, the doctors, the family, the police. He thought he had committed the perfect murder. The detectives heard every word. When they arrested Dennis Hellar, he was not even worried. He told them that it only takes one person on a jury with reasonable doubt to get an acquittal. He said slow poisoning is hard to prove. He really believed he was going to walk away from this a free man. But there was one thing Dennis had not counted on. Remember how there was no autopsy because of the Oklahoma City bombing? Remember how Carol's body was cremated before anyone suspected foul play? Well, here is the thing. Even though there was no full autopsy, the medical examiner did take some tissue samples from Carol before she was cremated. Just small pieces from her brain and kidneys, standard procedure in some cases. Those samples had been sitting in a lab somewhere, waiting, and now investigators knew exactly what to look for. When they tested those tissue samples, they found something: calcium oxalate crystals, tiny crystalline formations embedded in Carol's brain and kidney tissue. Now here is why that matters. When someone is exposed to ethylene glycol over a long period of time, their body breaks it down into various compounds. One of those compounds is oxalic acid. And oxalic acid combines with calcium in the body to form crystals. Calcium oxalate crystals. Those crystals build up in the organs, they clog the kidneys, they cause renal failure, and eventually death. The presence of those crystals in Carol's tissue samples proved beyond any doubt that she had been exposed to ethylene glycol over a prolonged period. This was not a one-time suicide attempt. This was months and months of slow, deliberate poisoning. Dr. Pokeless reviewed the findings and had some harsh words. He called Dennis a cold-hearted killer. He said anyone who could sit around and watch someone suffer for that long, month after month, and keep right on poisoning them anyway, was a monster. He said he could not even stand to watch an animal suffer like that, let alone his own spouse. So what was Dennis's motive? Why did he do this to Carol? The answer is sadly simple: money. Dennis had nothing. He was just a handyman doing odd jobs. No real savings, no property, nothing of value. But Carol? Carol had an apartment. She had a car. And most importantly, at least in Dennis's mind, she had a life insurance policy from J.C. Penney. Dennis wanted what Carol had. And he wanted Carol out of the way so he could have it. That is it. That is the reason a woman suffered for 10 months, visited hospitals 31 times, begged doctors to believe her, and finally died alone in a coma. Because her husband wanted her apartment and her car and a small life insurance payout. Faced with all this evidence, Dennis Hellar finally changed his tune. He pled guilty to manslaughter. In exchange for his plea, he was sentenced to life in prison. When you think about what actually caught him, it is kind of remarkable. It was investigators who refused to give up when everyone else thought it was just a natural death. It was one doctor in Ponca City who noticed elevated acid levels and ordered the right test, even though Carol left before getting the results. It was a girlfriend willing to wear a cheerleader outfit and a hidden microphone to get a confession. And it was forensic science. Those tissue samples that nobody thought would ever matter ended up being the key to the whole case. But here is the tragedy of it all. Carol went to the hospital 31 times. 31 times she sat in waiting rooms and examination rooms telling doctors that something was wrong. There is a simple test that can detect ethylene glycol in a person's system. It is not complicated or expensive, but not one single doctor in any of those hospitals over those 10 months ever thought to run that test. They saw a woman with a history of mental illness. They saw her medical records, and they decided that her complaints must be in her head. They wrote her off. They tuned her out. They sent her home again and again to the very person who was killing her. Carol spent the last months of her life being treated like she was crazy when she was actually being murdered. Carol's family spoke publicly after the case was resolved. Her sister could barely get the words out through her tears. She wanted to thank the doctor who finally figured out what was happening, even though it was too late. She hoped that Carol's story would save other lives, that maybe someone watching would recognize these symptoms in someone they love and speak up before it was too late. Because here is the truth. Forensic science catches up with everyone eventually. You are going to leave something behind. You are going to say something. They are going to find it one way or another. Dennis Hellar thought he committed the perfect murder, but he ended up spending the rest of his life in prison anyway. Now I have to ask you this. Dennis Hellar was charged with manslaughter and got life in prison. But manslaughter means they said it was not premeditated murder. After everything you just heard, after the eyedropper and the 10 months of slow poisoning and the burning of evidence before she even died, do you think manslaughter was the right charge? Or should this have been first-degree murder? Tell me what you think down in the comments, because I really want to hear your opinion on this. And that brings us to the end of today's story. A woman who just wanted a fresh start. A husband who answered a personal ad looking for his next victim. 31 hospital visits where nobody believed her. And a cheerleader outfit that finally brought the truth to light. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end. I appreciate each and every one of you. Until next time, stay safe out there. Keep your eyes open. And remember, if someone you love keeps getting mysteriously sick and the doctors cannot figure out why, maybe ask a few more questions. Goodbye for now.